Здравствуйте, and welcome to episode 22 of my Soviet Union vlog. In this episode, we are considering the final one of our theme 4 themes. This is about social development and particularly focusing on education and young people. In fact, it's narrowed down even further than that to being about the growth of primary, secondary, and higher education, or the growth of education, the reduction of illiteracy, and really those two things interleave with each other, as I'll explain, and state control of the curriculum, actually, which also interleaves with the others. So in this topic, you really are looking at questions that are going to be about success or failure of these policies, which is a change continuity type question. I say it's definitely, but I mean, very likely to be. It's hard to see how they could ask a cause or consequence question. They might ask a significance question and say, is education the most significant social development? And then you could compare it to policies about women or the unemployment policies that they had, or the employment policies that they had, which we've looked at previously. As indeed they have done. Was educational policy improved in the lives of people is one question that's been around in the past. There's been a couple focusing on the idea of how accurate is it to say that the most significant Soviet social development was the provision of social security. And then you can say, well, no, it wasn't. It's education or illiteracy. So let's have a look at these in turn. We're going to start with illiteracy to begin with. In Tsarist Russia, illiteracy was about 65%. Put it another way, only just over a third of people could read. And so in 1918, when the Bolsheviks got into power, they brought about a campaign to bring out the liquidation of illiteracy, very Bolshevik type phrase. Their aim was to make all 8 to 50-year-olds literate. And to do this, they set up tens of thousands of what they called liquidation points, likpunkty, is the Russian for that, Likpunktty. And these were set up to run 6-week literacy courses. 5 million people completed these courses between 1920 and 26. And they also, in the 20s, set up they set up lots of rabfaki, 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 Rabfaki. That's right. These were remedial schools. Millions of people attended these schools, which are mostly set up factories for people who had left school without basic skills. And the Red Army also plays a key role in the literacy campaign. All soldiers had to attend literacy classes as part of their service. In 1918, half of soldiers were literate. By 1925, all soldiers were literate. I'm a bit sceptical about that number, but that's what's recorded. And there's also a literacy league set up. You won't be surprised to learn they had their own magazine, Down with Illiteracy. There's also a particular focus on women in this liquidation of illiteracy campaign. Women were much more likely to be illiterate, especially in the Muslim areas of Central Asia. 14 out of 17 million people that were illiterate were women in 1917. Under Stalin, this policy carries on. He sends cultural soldiers into the villages. There's initial resistance, but actually by the end of the 1930s, as you'll see, it's quite a lot of success. So literacy rates, 1914, well, we said Tsarist Russia, 35%, 1914, about 38%, 1928, 55%. So those initial campaigns have some success, but there were some barriers. The census in 1939 said that in urban areas, the literacy rate was 94%, so staggering success. 86% in rural areas. By 1959, it was basically everyone, 99% in urban areas, 98% in the countryside. So let's move on to education. In Tsarist times, education was really the preserve of the wealthy. The Tsarist government never made school attendance compulsory. The rich had access to education, some middle class, but not really the poor. That said, the Russian Orthodox Church had set up quite a lot of primary schools. There were several thousand peasant-run schools, but basically most children, if they did attend school at all, tended to drop out before even completing their primary education. In fact, in rural areas, 88% of children failed to complete primary education. And so set against that backdrop and that starting point, the Soviet progress is really genuinely impressive. In 1917, Anatoly Lunachevsky became Commissar for Education. His name is worth just repeating, Lunachevsky, Lunachevsky. And he established an ambitious program to provide free, universal, compulsory education for all children aged from 7 to 17 years. And they were going to take in children of all abilities, they're all going to get the same education until the last couple of years of secondary education. That's the plan. But although Lincharski has that plan, it's not really achieved in his lifetime up to 1929. The problem is partly due to the lack of resources. Narkompros, Narkompos, Narkompros, the education ministry, I guess we would call it, they could only provide one pencil for every 60 students. Students were writing in coal because they had no other implements. Teachers were poorly paid. They often had classes of about 40 children or more. They're expected to do the cleaning as well in their spare time. Dropout rates were really high. In 1926, the average child only attended 2.77 years of school. So by the time of the end of Lenin's time, progress had been small, but they had certainly set out on that journey. Good old Stalin brings things home a bit better. So during the 30s, the goal of providing compulsory education was largely achieved in urban areas. The number of children in education increased from 14 million in 1929 to over 20 million in 1931. But most children fail to continue their education beyond the first 2 years of secondary education. So it is still limited how much they're getting, but they are still getting more than they had before. And the standard of teaching in rural areas does also benefit from the scattering of teachers through the Great Terror out to even ever more remote places through being put in gulags and internal exile and all that sort of stuff. And in the 30s, they also extended education to children whose parents were from aristocratic bourgeois backgrounds or were enemies of the people. So it is genuinely comprehensive. Also in the 30s, they established the basic pattern of Soviet education. That was 4 years of primary education, followed by 3 years of secondary education, incomplete secondary education, after which you could stay on, but you didn't have to do 2 or 3 more years to complete your secondary education. Or you could go and do something vocational, or you could just leave and go to work. So that was plan 4, and then 3, and then maybe 2 or 3 more. In 1951, so towards the end of Stalin's era, there was a plan put in place to implement a 10-year compulsory programme by 1955 in urban areas, and that was extended in 1960 to rural areas as well. They didn't quite manage that. They made an 8-year programme. Nevertheless, if we think back to 1917, still staggering progress within 40 or 50 years of the Bolsheviks getting in power. In the 1980s, the only sort of other change to the education system was in the 1980s, the Soviet government turned many of their general academic schools into specialist schools for particular subjects like maths or science or foreign language, and demand for the access to those schools was particularly high. So some of the barriers to expansion of universal education, these are fairly obvious really. The Civil War dislocates the country. Under the NEP, spending on education declines. Lack of resources, low wages and status of teachers. School transport was an issue, particularly, I guess, in rural areas. That had to be paid for by parents until the mid-1960s. And parents also had to pay for textbooks and uniforms and things like that, and that restricts the access for the poor. For poor rural children in particular, those children often left school before completing their education. Having said that the teachers are scattered through the 1930s, that's the upside. Of course, that's also a downside. Many teachers were removed from village schools during the 1930s. Some of them were labelled kulaks. Some of them were shopped out by their, if they were unpopular, by their students or families in the village, and were sent off. And lots of schools ended up with no teacher at all. They are more spread out, but there are some who don't. And the Great Patriotic War also, lots of teachers were killed in the war. 82,000 schools were destroyed. And after the war, it takes quite a long time to rebuild those schools and get those teachers back and trained. In the 50s, Khrushchev had a particular concern that there was still a disparity between urban and rural education, and particularly that attendance at rural schools was a problem, especially during harvest time. And that persists all the way through the Soviet era. In fact, in 1981, a head teacher from a school in Kyrgyzstan complained in Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, that students were not turning up for the new term until November, when the harvest had been finished. Another kind of barrier to education through the Soviet Union was what was called Russification. And this was the idea that education was being used as a tool of the state to Russify the whole Soviet Union, or make it all more Russian. Ethnic minorities are particularly resistant to that. All school children had to learn Russian. Teachers were usually Russian. A lot of the teaching often happened in Russian. They were allowed to teach in their own ethnic language in areas where they spoke predominantly that. But having said that, a lot of the materials were still produced and taught in Russian because there was people were worried about not teaching in Russian. In the Central Asian areas, Muslim attitudes also prevent education spreading so far, particularly their attitude towards girls getting education. In the Uzbek Republic in the mid 1950s, girls only made up a quarter of the school population in the last couple of years of secondary education. And as time goes on in sort of 60s and 70s in particular, changes are limited or influenced by the Soviet elite who perceive education as the way that promotes their children and their families as against the working class. So that it starts to entrench a new kind of social stratification. That's not too fancy a phrase. So that's the school education system. Just a little word about higher education before we move on. After 1917, in 1917, Narkompros, the education ministry, declared that universities should be open for all. This program was resisted by universities who didn't want people with no qualifications coming to them, so the government just took over control of higher education, trying to make equality of access to higher education a universal thing. In 1929, they dropped requirements for entry to universities and had a quota system introduced that 70% of places had to be offered to students of working class origin. But that target was never met, and it led to a dropout rate of 70%. That's quite nice and round, isn't it? 70% of places to working class, 70% dropout rate. Probably not entirely the same people, but lots of them would be. The quota system actually ended up being abolished in 1935, and they go back to emphasising quality rather than quantity. Even so, the working class still have more opportunities than they had had 20 years before. So there is progress, it's just not quite as dramatic and revolutionary as the Bolsheviks might have liked. Khrushchev had actually been a Rabfaki student. He'd been one of those people who had left, gone into work without any formal education, and had been educated later on in life. So when he comes to power, he's quite alert to the anomalies in the education system and the inequalities in the education system. He tried to expand adult and higher education for the children of workers in particular, placed greater emphasis on technical and vocational education rather than academic and theoretical. And there became an increasing concern to make Soviet education keep pace with technological skills. Again, as the space race progresses in the 60s and 70s, then you get computers later on as well. Soviets are always behind in that, but they do start to kind of think about how they're going to teach their children these things in their schools. On the basis of this, in 1964, by 1964, the expansion of higher education institutes specialising in technical subjects meant that there were 500,000 students studying in higher education on a part-time basis to top up their skills. That said, under Brezhnev, this is seen as being restricting the availability of education for the party elites, and Brezhnev drops or winds back most of the more revolutionary changes that Khrushchev had brought in. By the 1980s, adult education classes were normally supported by TV and radio programs. Quite a lot of people were studying part-time in the evenings. Correspondence courses were popular. Education was seen as being a way to get forward in the Soviet state. So, just in recapping all this, all aspects of the curriculum are controlled by the state. There's an emphasis on Soviet values, and the duty to the state was instilled at an early age. There's an approach to memorizing knowledge which didn't suit all students by any means. There's no creativity or ability to think for yourselves embedded in. That said, the Academy of Sciences produces a large scientific intelligentsia for the world, the largest in the world by the 1970s, and 8 Soviet scientists were awarded the Nobel Prize for Science during the Soviet Union. Good things about the Soviet education system: free tuition with a short spell between 1940 and 56 where that wasn't quite true. And there were grants to help with living costs, although these were low, and most students ended up working part-time to cover their expenses. By the early 80s, a third of all Soviet citizens were involved in some education. But Soviet education was, rather than promoting or ensuring equality, it was by then still kind of helping retain distinctions in Soviet society. So I'm going to crack on. It might make it quite a long episode, but I think we'll do all of this together. And we're going to talk a little bit about the curriculum itself. So we've talked about the school system and education as a whole. This is actually what is taught in classes. The curriculum is seen by the Soviet government, quite predictably, as an instrument of social control and propaganda. They want to use it to instill socialist values and attitudes in the population and help create the new Soviet man and socialist woman. Also, it's a way of undermining and attacking traditional practices and beliefs, such as religion or patriarchal attitudes that are embedded in society. And it's an important method of Russification, of bringing a sense of unity under Russian dominance to the Soviet Union. So great care was taken in the 1930s to match the secondary education to the 5-year plans. And then, as we've said also, in the 50s and 60s, developing on to bring more technological knowledge and skills into the curriculum too. Early on, however, there was quite a radical approach to the curriculum, influenced by those who want to make schools kind of mini versions of socialist society. Children study themes like farming or nature rather than traditional subjects. Tests were abolished, corporal punishment was forbidden, children were given a role in deciding what was going to happen in the schools and what was going to be taught. The authority of teachers was kind of declined completely. Some teachers were actually dismissed by their own class, and some other schools just fell into chaos. As a result of that, under Stalin, there was part of the Great Retreat of socialist policies was a return to quite traditional educational policies. Under him, traditional discipline, no surprise there, making sure individuals know their place within the society. Traditional subjects, exams were brought back, pigtails returned for schoolgirls as compulsory, and teachers were back in charge. A couple of good examples of how the curriculum, in detail, was affected by the Soviet government. History. In 1938, Stalin personally intervened to ensure that the right history was being taught in the Soviet Union, and endorsed the book The History of the All-Union Communist Party, or the short course. But then under Khrushchev, the Boris Ponomaryov wrote The History of the Communist Party, edited rather. He was just kind of the chief chap that put it together. That heavily revised Stalin's role, accusing him of economic mistakes and errors, systematically removing his name from any link with anything good, and giving credit to the party and the people instead. So that was kind of just pushing down Stalin's role in education. Under Brezhnev, Stalin just became ignored in the history books, as if the famine and 1932 and the Gulag had just never existed. Other examples of curriculum stuff being tampered with by the government for political ends. Russian, of course, we've mentioned already. All students had to learn Russian. And as I said before, that you could learn things in your native language, but Russian literature or Soviet literature was rarely taught in native languages. Worth also saying that all schools had to provide vocational training or release students to go somewhere else for vocational training if they wanted it. And Khrushchev in particular tried to put the student in touch with real life in their education experience. And that's quite unpopular, and Brezhnev dropped that when he became leader. The other thing to say is that, of course, Marxist theory was part of education throughout, even in kindergartens, where Uncle Lenin and Uncle Stalin had their own sort of shrines and pictures around the kindergarten. And the final thing to say about the curriculum is that, unlike most systems of the time, there was no differentiation between girls and boys at all, except in the Great Patriotic War and just after, where boys were given basic military training at school and girls were given nursing education at school for more obvious reasons. Right, so finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about youth groups and the informal education that was provided to students or young people outside of school. And this comes in the way of 3 groups. First of all, the Little Octobrists for children aged 5 to 9 who learned nursery rhymes, played simple games. Then the Young Pioneers, which was set up in 1922. This is ages 10 to 14. Members had to promise to love their country, follow the teachings of Lenin and the Communist Party. They had a uniform of a red neckerchief and the Pioneers badge. They encouraged good behaviour in school. They would go camping, hiking. They also had talks from Red Army and factory workers. And then when you were 14 or possibly 15, the textbooks do vary slightly, you could join the Komsomol, the Young Communist League. It was seen as being essential for progressing in the Communist Party. And in the Komsomol, you were called upon to root out class enemies. They were used to build industrial centres during the 5-year plans. Khrushchev called on them to provide volunteers for the Virgin Land Scheme. It grew from 2.3 million members in 1929 to 10.2 million members in 1940. Stalin used them as spies during the terror. Khrushchev, actually, this is a little bit about change, I suppose. Stalin used them as spies in the terror. Khrushchev tried to tap into the idealism amongst Komsomol members to remind citizens of what communism was about. Brezhnev saw them as young and ambitious and slightly annoying and wanted them to learn their place in society, to have discipline and respect and accept the status quo. By the 1980s, they were expected to report upon help with community schemes and report on deviant behaviour, like kids listening to foreign music or getting engaged in vandalism. By 1982, Komsomol membership was more than 40 million. So just to wrap up then, change and continuity, what you can see here is that there's, success or failure, there's a fair amount of success, but you need to kind of focus in on the areas where progress is slow, particularly rural areas, and then perhaps also in vocational education. And it doesn't really bring about the equality that the idealistic ideas at the start wanted it to. In terms of change and continuity, you have again got that pattern of a radical start, quite a traditional set of values from Stalin, some reform under Khrushchev briefly before it settles into a fairly traditional setup under Brezhnev towards the end. But I hope that's quite a good overview for you. And next time we'll be starting to focus on the story of Gorbachev and the decline of the Soviet Union. See you then.